Through dreams, the various dwelling places in our lives co-penetrate and retain the treasure of former days. And after we are in the new house, when memories of other places we have lived in come back to us, we travel to the land of motionless childhood, motionless in the way all immemorial things are. We live fixations, fixations of happiness. We comfort ourselves by reliving memories of protection. Something closed must retain our memories while leaving them their original value as images. Memories of the outside world will never have the same tonality of those of home. By recalling these memories, we add to our store of dreams. We are never real historians, but always near poets, and our emotion is perhaps nothing but an expression of a poetry that was lost. Gaston Bachelard, The Poetics of Space. Gaston Bachelard's The Poetic of Space explores the phenomenology of architecture and the intimate relationship between spaces and the human experience. Bachelard argues that spaces are not merely physical entities, but are also laden with emotional and imaginative significance. He explores how space can invoke memories, dreams, and emotions, shaping our perception and experience of the world. Of course, not all of our memories are happy ones, and not all of the places that we have inhabited over the course of our lifetime immediately bring to mind fond memories. In fact, the opposite is often the case. This video essay will explore the oftentimes ignored connection between grief and space. That is, the space that we occupy and how grief shapes and molds our interpretations of that space. Furthermore, this connection will be explored through the lens of French philosophy, specifically the writings of Bachelard. Grief is a complex and multifaceted emotional response to a loss. It is a natural and universal human experience that can manifest in various forms, both emotionally and physically. While commonly associated with the death of a loved one, grief can also be triggered by other types of loss, such as the end of a relationship, a job, a significant life change, or even the loss of a cherished dream or expectation. The relationship between grief and space is a complicated one, but one of the most salient features is what the philosopher Matthew Wycliffe has identified as the physical presence of absence. That is the phenomenological impact that grief has on what Wycliffe calls the habituated world that we inhabit. Wycliffe explains that although the loss of a loved one occurred in the past, there are still ways in which this loss can be experienced in the present moment. We exist in a habituated world, that is, a world that was once inhabited by people who acted and behaved in certain ways. This world, of course, does not disappear with the loss of a loved one, but rather continues to persist in spite of or even after their departure. As Wycliffe explains, this paradoxical presence/absence involves continually to experience one's surroundings in ways that presuppose certain capacities. For example, someone who has recently lost a family member existed in a habituated world or space in which that person or those people once interacted with and impacted. The space, then, regardless of what sort of space we are talking about, is inundated with the combination of imagination and memory which impacts the individual's interpretations of that space. Although the members of our family may now be removed from the world, we are not, and therefore we continue to feel their presence in the spaces that we live. This is exactly what makes grief so difficult and why the connection with physical space is so important. We continue to persist in a state in which coping with loss becomes almost an impossibility because the loss of our loved one is not, quote, past, but rather a present experience. This present experience is continually embodied in the physical space in which we continue to inhabit. The French philosopher Maurice de Ponty, in his Phenomenology of Perception, claimed that the passage of time does not carry away impossible projects, nor does it seal off the traumatic experience. The subject still remains open to the same impossible future, if not in his explicit thoughts, then at least in his actual being. These sentiments represent an explicit rejection of the commonly held platitude that time heals all wounds. The assumption implicit within this platitude is that past trauma may be softened with the passage of time. Instead, what we have represented here, articulated by William Faulkner, is a different sentiment that holds that, quote, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Time, according to the psychologist Pierre Janet, is generally interpreted as the whole that groups our stories together. The story of our past is defined and contextualized by our memories, and the natural assumption here is to think of time as a sort of container of those memories. Janet refers to time in this view as a basket in which memories are stored. The question posed by Janet, however, and developed later by Bachelard, is whether or not this basket is a real thing and not a kind of story itself. The upshot, according to Bachelard, is that memories which stand out to an individual are largely subjective in terms of their perceived importance. As the philosopher Jordi Fernandez points out, memories are not passive, but represent rather intentional states. Memory experiences in this respect are similar to our perceptual experiences. The experience of a memory and its subsequent interpretation by the person who has experienced it is consequently an active process. Bachelard explains that our personal history is therefore simply the story of our disconnected actions, and as we tell it, with the help of reason. In other words, the individual imposes a form of continuity or duration on his or her past through the use of reason. We seek to explain and make sense of the events which have happened to us when, in reality, there is no unbroken causal linkage between these events, at least not psychologically speaking. The self in this view could be considered a rational construct which shares the same sort of ontological reality as duration. For the most part, our sense of self lies in the past, and according to Bachelard, knowing ourselves means finding ourselves again in these scattered personal events. The meaning that the individual derives from these events is therefore dynamic and subject to change. With respect to grief, we are left in this paradoxical situation. Bachelard, in his Intuition of the Instant, says that for the person who continues to love, a lost love is both present and past. Present for the faithful heart, past for the unhappy heart. The loss of our loved one will always be with us, and so long as we exist in the world that was impacted by their presence, the space in which we exist will also remind us of their absence. Time and space, to the individual who is grieving, represents a double-edged sword. They are both the source of pain and solace. Pain in that we are constantly reminded of our loss, and solace in that we don't want to forget our loss. Concerning this paradox, I leave you with the words of Bachelard at the end of his Intuition of the Instant. Bachelard says that at the root of this contemplative redemption, we believe lies a force that enables us to accept life in a single act with all of its intimate contradictions. In placing absolute nothingness at both edges of the instant, Rumpel must have been led to such intensity of consciousness that the entire image of a density was legible in a sudden glimmer within the very act of mind and spirit. The profound case of Rumpelan melancholy can perhaps be traced to this metaphysical necessity. We must hold both regret and hope within one and the same thought, a felt synthesis of contraries. Such is the lived instant. We are moreover capable of reversing the effective axis of time, placing hope within a memory into which freshness has been restored through our reverie. On the other hand, we might be well discouraged by contemplating the future, for at certain times, at the peak of maturity for instance, we realize that we can no longer postpone the custody of our hopes until tomorrow. The bitterness of life is the regret of not being able to hope, of no longer being able to hear the rhythms that beckon us to play our part in the symphony of becoming. It is then that the smiling regret advises us to invite death and to welcome the monotonous rhythm like a lullaby.